A lot of early stage startups try to chase growth too soon. They maybe see early signs of product market fit and try to put everything into growth at that point. And the reality is they don't have product market fit. They don't have strong, flattened, usage-based retention at some significantly high level. They haven't learned how to repeatedly monetize that usage. And so I think chasing growth too early is definitely something that's problematic.
Welcome to the Product Weekend podcast with B2B, Moita and Tojal. We hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Product Weekend podcast. I'm your host, Tojal, joined by my co-host Moita. Today, we're to dive deep into the realm of product-led growth with a true pioneer in the field, Ben Williams, also known as the Product-Led Geek. With over 2 decades of experience in product and growth roles, Ben has been instrumental in shaping PLG strategies that have driven substantial growth for B2B SaaS companies. In this episode, we'll explore Ben's journey to becoming a proponent of product-led growth, how PLG principles can transform the way companies build and market products, challenges and triumphs Ben faced while implementing PLG strategies at companies like Sneak and CloudBees, practical insights on building and nurturing high-performing product teams under the PLG model, and the evolving relationship between sales-led and product-led strategies in the tech industry. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your network, as that will make you look good, point number one and most important, but also help us grow and bring you even more interesting conversations with great guests. So whether you're new to the concept of PLG or looking to refine your approach, this conversation is packed with valuable insights that can help you leverage product-led strategies to their fullest potential. Let's get started. Hello, Ben. Welcome to the Product Weekend podcast.
Hey, it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hello.
Perfect. So we want to start easy. So I'm going to ask you a really easy question, I hope. So what's a recent weekend that you really enjoyed?
Recent weekend that I really enjoyed. It's a great question. I think simply having my brother and his family come and visit us last weekend, spend some time with us. They live around 2.5 hours away. Don't get to see them too often. So it's always great to be able to spend time with them.
No, that's great. It's been spending time with family, right? That's always a plus. Good. Just for the people that don't know you, can you give us a brief introduction about your background?
Sure. Yep. So I'm Ben Williams, also known as the Product-Led Geek. I have been a product and growth operator for over 20 years. And for the last 3 of those years, actually more like 4 of those years, have been advising companies. But most recently, the last 2 years, I've been doing that full time.
Okay. So I have to start with asking you, what is product-led growth?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. I think the way I like to think about product-led growth is that just taking it back to first principles and fundamentals, it's about solving meaningful problems in elegant ways by creating experiences that users love, they want to keep using, and they want to tell the world about. But you might have heard that phrase, the product sells itself. And in its purest form, with PLG, there's no human touch whatsoever, right? The product activates, it engages, it retains, and subsequently monetizes users and their teams without any kind of human intervention. By that regard, it's completely self-serve. It's zero touch. But in practice, what that really means is you acquire new users, they experience some value, you activate them and get them to build habits around the product. And then you either directly monetize them or they bring in some other users and some of those other users who may directly monetize, or both. But the key here is that users are experiencing the value in PLG before you're asking them to pay. And that's, in contrast to traditional sales-led approaches where all of that value is gated up front with some kind of paywall.
Yeah, that's right. But how did you get here? How did you become this proponent of PLG? Was there like a pivotal moment in your career where you felt like this is the right approach?
I think my approach to product has always been one centered in having deep empathy for users and their problems. And so you see this very much so in B2C, where it's all about serving the end user. And in fact, PLG as a term in B2B is fairly recent, but all of the principles and concepts that underpin B2B PLG were really pioneered in the approach to consumer software. And you might have seen the term or the phrase that PLG is like the consumerization of B2B. And that's very, very true. So I've always had that kind of curiosity and deep empathy for the user in my approach to how I think about product. And so this go-to-market motion, as it started to emerge, was something that I naturally gravitated towards. I led product and growth and design at a company called Cloudbees, which had an open core model. So building enterprise software around some open source software, and there's very much aspects to PLG there. And then I went on to lead PLG at Sneak. And so I've seen a lot of different sides of this coin when it comes to the approach to providing PLG. And I think the thing that resonates most deeply with me is building on this innate human desire to discover and adopt solutions to problems that we're facing. And PLG just exploits that to really meet users where they are and to help them before we try to extract any kind of reciprocal value from them. It's something that relies on delightful user experience to fuel our growth loops across levers of acquisition, retention, monetization, and you can be product-led in any of those growth levers. And if the product itself doesn't allow for self-serve, or maybe it does, but the user experience isn't intuitive, then you get to this point where inevitably humans need to intervene. And of course, that's what pretty much all SaaS products look like once upon a time. And that's the sales-led approach. And sales-led companies have always focused on serving the needs of the buyer. And everything they do has been oriented around that buyer persona. And I've lived that life as well, right? I've worked in a lot of organizations that were sales-led, but PLG can't be successful without changing that. If you really want to embrace PLG, the approach you take to how you build and distributing product means you need user centricity at the heart of everything you do. You have to have that deep empathy for users and their problems. And it's something that needs to be core to how every function in the business approaches their work, not just product, not just growth. If I think back to my time at Sneak, we actually had a core principle in the product and growth teams that reinforced that need for user centricity. And that principle was know the user. And it was about being empathetic and curious about our users, about their motivations, about the problems they faced and their behavior. And if you want to serve users and their teams better, you just have to be close to them every day. I like to challenge the teams I lead to be the people in the company that know our users better than anyone else. Everyone should take on that challenge really and try and outdo each other on that regard. And I think we'd all be a lot better for that. But for me, that's where it all starts, bringing product and growth teams and more widely, the broader organization closer to the users that you're serving. It's definitely not the only consideration in making PLG successful, but it's absolutely something you will find at the core of every company that's driven sustainable growth through product-led approaches, for sure.
Cool. And you mentioned the sales-led approach, which is the most traditional, especially in B2B. Do you think there's an inherent problem with it, or do you think there's a place for it in some contexts?
No, I think there's definitely a place for it. Although increasingly, I think there are aspects to the go-to-market approach for all companies that should have product-led elements. Like, I strongly believe that even the most staunch, steadfast, sales-led companies, products that where a sales-led approach is a good fit, for example, those that require complete standardization across the entire organization, there's no opportunity for end user individual adoption and growth from the bottom up. Things like HR systems or financial systems that are org-wide purchasing decisions, and there's no adoption of different types of technologies there within a company. Those kinds of products, great fit for sales-led approaches. However, that being said, when we think about kind of retention, and if I'm working on one of those products, I want my product teams to have a product-led mindset when it comes to retention. I want them to be focusing on the user and their needs and making sure that the experience of the users of that product is better than anything else out there. It's meeting the needs because we deeply understand what those needs are, and we're building elegant solutions to them. Because I strongly believe that if you don't do that, then some competitor will eventually materialize that does have that focus. And when it comes to a choice then between two competing solutions, the voice of the user will, and the user base across your entire company will ultimately ring very loud, I think, and absolutely influence the decision.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And you've been touching on a lot of things we want to talk about. So I'm going to bring it back a little bit because you're talking about the evolution of the concept of PLG. So how do you see that it evolved over time, especially in B2B SaaS companies? Did it change since you've been using it?
I think there's definitely a more nuanced understanding of the science behind PLG, and certainly things like Reforge and a lot of the frameworks that have been popularized through programs like Reforge have helped bring a little bit of science to the discipline. So taking the overall approach and that essence of PLG that I described and thinking about how to make that actionable. For example, how should you think about taking new users on a journey from zero through to a point where they have habitualized the use of the product? How do you think about that activation journey through the different steps of setup, of seeing some value and having that aha moment to building some kind of habit around the product? And then from there, how do you keep users engaged and keep their teams engaged over a period of time? So there's definitely maturity that has come naturally as over the years in this space. Overall, I think the essence remains identical. Again, it's about deeply understanding users, catering to their needs and taking them on a journey. Now, when you think about monetization, yes, I think we're starting to see more changes there from the perspective of we did have very polar opposites, and it was all about product-led growth versus sales-led growth. And now increasingly so it's about how the two can better work together through product-led sales processes and so on. So I think that's probably the part that's seen most evolution in the last 12 to 24 months.
Okay, perfect. So now we'd like to ask you for a time when you really had to solve a big challenge. I don't know if you knew if in your career, in terms of implementing a PLG strategy, you ever had to really face a big challenge, and we'd like to know how you overcame it, and if there are some lessons that other companies can learn from that.
Super interesting question. You know, when I joined Sneak as a leader, we were working. I joined the organization from a position of what I would call organizational debt in a lot of key areas. And when you're joining a fast-growing business, there's a lot of expectation around the results you'll deliver. And fundamentally, to establish a product growth organization, to get them to a place where they can start to deliver results, you need to have a lot of prerequisites in place. And so I think one of the biggest challenges I had to overcome as a leader in that, as a new leader in an organization with those kind of expectations, was actually really having a strong awareness of the organization that I was going into and the existing lay of the land and the circumstances there, and understanding what was missing from a prerequisites perspective in terms of the things that a growth organization would need to exist. And that goes from everything from lack of skills and knowledge to lack of process to lack of data to not even having good alignment around what PLG meant to the business. And as a leader, there was a lot of work that needed to go into evangelizing all of that stuff to build alignment around it and filling a lot of those gaps. And I think it's critically important, particularly for senior leaders, to provide that air cover needed and strong alignment all the way up to the executive team to facilitate getting the organization to a healthy place and not just trying to put blinkers on and proceed without laying some of those important foundations.
And diving a bit deeper in that example, how do you cultivate this culture within the team? Like, how can you get people on board with this way of thinking and make sure that everyone is rowing in the same direction?
Yeah, it's super important. That there's a phrase I love that is repetition never spoilt the prayer, and that is basically just acknowledging the fact that some things you need to say a lot of times in many different ways and in many different places and forums for it to really set in. It's the reason principles, product principles, growth principles are so important in these contexts. But if you take a step back and think about how to create an environment that is most likely to result in kind of the outcomes that you want as a business to be realized, then how do you build an organization? How do you build teams that are most likely to succeed in those environments? Then the first thing, and it goes back to, I think, the way I think as a product person, is just to know your context, right? Arguably, this is the most important step. If you get this wrong, then nothing else will matter. But understand, what are the core business priorities? What's the product vision and mission? If there isn't one, like are you the person who needs to create those things? What's the product strategy? What's the growth strategy? What opportunities exist? What are the big bets you want to make? Are you a single product? Are you a suite of products? Are you a platform? What's the relevant go-to-market approach? What constraints are you facing? Maybe those are constraints in how you grow, or maybe they're internal constraints, like you've got some architectural tech debt that you've accrued that needs prioritization to address, or maybe there's some operational constraints, like around the ability of the product team to analyze and interpret and derive insights from large volumes of customer feedback and other inputs. So all of that context gives you a level of situational awareness that lets you really understand how you should design the organization and create an environment that is conducive to getting the results. So I think that's the first step, and I can talk more about how I think about taking that and designing the organization and so on. But yeah,
it would be interesting to get a bit more in depth there. Like, how do you operationalize it and set the people in the right direction?
Yeah.
If you want to give a specific example, maybe it's easier.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to designing the organization, I wrote a post about this recently, actually. There's both macro design elements and micro design elements. So at the macro level, understanding what the overall structure should be of the org, and your org might be one team, it might be 100 teams, right?
Yeah.
Understanding that overall structure, what the teams are doing, what's going to be their focus. And that focus needs to be aligned with the strategy and the context. So that's why that first step of understanding that context and having that situational awareness is so important. And, for product teams, it's a little bit more straightforward. But for growth teams, you'll also have to consider whether a centralized structure or a decentralized structure is most appropriate, and balancing their trade-offs. Like in centralized structures, the growth org, you'll typically have an independent entity within the company, probably reporting up to a single growth leader, whereas those kind of teams can typically learn faster, but are siloed, and that siloed nature limits the natural spread of growth culture across the company. In decentralized teams, that you don't have that independent growth org. Some teams mixed across the product org have growth responsibility while reporting still to their respective functional leaders. And that's great for growth culture, but those teams can be slowed down by additional dependencies and competing priorities and so on. So you've got decisions to make around those kind of things. How you set the org up at a macro level. And then when you think about the next level down, the micro level, you've got to think about what's the team composition look like. So what roles are you having on teams? And again, for product teams, it's fairly standardized, I think. Growth teams, a little bit less. You often need specialization. A team focused on acquisition probably will have some kind of specialization. And again, that specific specialization might vary. Is it going to be someone with SEO expertise? Is it going to be someone who's very strong on paid performance marketing and so on? And again, your growth model, your growth strategy is going to dictate those kind of needs. And then when you go past roles, who are the actual people in each team? Like, what you need people with the right fit, the right skills, the right experience, the right approach, the right mindset. You don't want to jam a square peg into a round hole, right? Although I will say that building a new team from scratch is quite rare, where everyone on the team would be external hires and you can perfectly get the exact right fit in there. You're often like borrowing resources from other places within the organization. So there's going to be some constraints you're working with around building teams. But once you've gone that far, then creating the environment is I think the really important thing. And this is where I think one of the things that really differentiates great product leaders, and that is that they really craft an environment that is conducive to their teams achieving the outcomes that they're striving for. And practically, for empowered product and growth teams, that means things like giving them ownership and accountability for their outcomes, but at the same time providing them with the context of a product or growth strategy that helps them understand where to play and where not to play. And in fact, actually having them co-create that is often a point of extreme leverage as well. It means removing organizational friction with other functions across the company to support easier collaboration, to support easier access to users and customers and so on, getting things out of their way. It means providing them with principles that establish the mindset and approach to product development that you want, that they can apply kind of day to day, setting them up with a process that gives them guardrails and consistency in how they work, but at the same time doesn't limit their creativity and stop them getting things done. Obvious stuff around access to necessary data, behavioral analytics, and so on, tooling for experimentation, all that stuff. Operational support where necessary. I mentioned earlier that potential context of a team that might be overloaded by customer feedback, and that might imply investing in technology that helps address that, or it might mean establishing some sort of product ops function in support of the product team, or both, and providing training and education. All of this stuff is how you are going to facilitate a team achieving great outcomes. And I think, again, that's something that great product leaders do effortlessly.
Oh, perfect. That was great. Thank you very much for sharing. So I want to pick up on a topic that you brought up before about the rule-based growth strategy. So In your materials, you emphasize a lot the importance of identifying and documenting the growth loops. So could you walk us through the process of identifying these loops, and then how do you integrate them into a company's growth strategy?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies have growth loops, even if they don't think of them as growth loops, is the first point. And maybe I'll take a step back and kind of describe how I think about this. So loop-based growth strategy, to me, it's about understanding how you grow and how you could grow in the future through the lens of self-reinforcing loops. And then it's about finding the highest points of leverage in that strategy, in that model, to be able to win. There's also all sorts of different types of loops: viral loops, content loops, paid loops. What differentiates them is their input. Like for viral loops, it's users. For content loops, it's content. For paid loops, it's capital or dollars. And those things are also the constraints of each loop. So the more fuel going into the loop, the faster it will spin. And conversely, when the input is constrained, then the loop slows. So the thing about loops, though, is that you can reinvest the output of each revolution of the loop back into the loop as an input. So that naturally leads to you thinking about how to remove friction and optimize conversion between each step of each loop to get it to spin faster. And different loops will play a different role in your overall growth model and strategy. So you might have loops that are focused on acquisition and bringing in new users, and you might have different loops that focus on engagement or keeping existing users engaged or increasing their level of engagement. I'll give an example with an acquisition loop. Probably the simplest form of acquisition loop is a viral loop, a word of mouth loop, where one happy user tells someone else about the product, and that person goes on to sign up. They become a happy user and then tell someone else about the product, and so on. So there's all these different types of loops, and how you go about identifying them is really just taking a step back and understanding today, asking the question, how do we grow today? And thinking through those frameworks, right? And it takes practice to get this, but the more you do it, the more easy it will be to identify those things. And once you've identified them, you can start to understand how they all relate to each other. And that's a really important thing. But I'll come back to that. If I think back to my time at Sneak, there were a bunch of loops that were already existing that we documented when I joined. And then there were a bunch of loops that we decided we wanted to layer on top to enhance the overall model and improve the way that all the loops worked together. So Sneak had a bunch of acquisition growth loops of different types. We had company-generated, company-distributed content loops like the Sneak vulnerability database, and later one that we added called Sneak Advisor. We had team invites, which were a form of collaborative personal viral loops. We had referrals, which were incentivized personal viral loops. And we had even really basic stuff like sales loops, where, just fundamentally, the more revenue generated, that would lead to reinvestment in more salespeople to generate more revenue to reinvest. So a bunch of all those different loops. I can go into some of them specifically, but I think it only really becomes a strategy when you understand and design all these loops to work together synergistically in a macro context where one loop is spinning faster, and that helps others in the loop become more effective. Like with Sneak, the various acquisition loops we had, they work together in a macro level to create a data network effect where the quality of the product was improved by the nature of having more data to model, to inform risk scores, and to drive the advice about fixing vulnerabilities that we provided to users. That additional data also enabled richer content for some of the content loops like the vulnerability database and so on. Those are fairly specific examples, but they illustrate how these loops in a well-designed strategy are playing off each other in that larger context.
Hey everyone, Tojal here. If you're enjoying the Product Weekend podcast, we'd really appreciate your support. Please take a moment to rate us on your favorite podcast platform. Your rating helps us reach more listeners passionate about product management. Also, if you know someone who would enjoy this episode, don't hesitate to share it with them. It's a great way to spread valuable insights and support our podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive back into our conversation.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So the growth strategy ends up being like this overview of all these loops and how they interact with each other and how they feed into each other. That's cool.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe I would ask you to give us some examples more, maybe like in the form of a library, let's say, for our listeners to be able to look at their own situations and try to identify them. What are maybe 5 or 6 or how many you think of examples of growth loops?
Yeah, so I can walk you through, for example, a user-generated content loop, which is Quora. Everyone understands and is probably familiar with Quora, whereby users are ultimately answering questions. So that's what we call user-generated content. That content is being then distributed to the search engine by Quora. Google is obviously indexing those pages and making them available. Users are looking for answers to questions, so they Google their question. They find those results at the top of their search results. Some percentage of them click on those results and visit Quora, and some percentage of those users sign up to Quora and ask their own questions. And again, people respond, generate, and that loop goes on. So there's a user-generated content loop. You can also get company-generated content loops. So company-generated content loops are, instead of users producing the content, then the company, the vendor, is producing them. I'll give a Sneak example for this. So Sneak Advisor, that's a kind of a sidecar product to the main Sneak platform, but it's a product that allows developers to find and evaluate the best open source package for their projects that they're working on. Has a database of like over 1 million open source packages that devs can query and compare across aspects of how popular is this package, how well maintained is it, what's the community around it, how secure is it, which is obviously the tie-in with the main Sneak platform. And Advisor provides scores across each of those areas, uses the main Sneak product for the security assessment, and it gives an overall health score. Devs are out there every day just Googling for packages and components they're considering using in their apps. And there's no one behind the scenes making all of these pages at Sneak. It's all programmatically done. The Sneak Advisor engine is going off and indexing the packaging managers, traversing links out to GitHub and so on, and understanding the popularity of packages and so on, and then automatically generating and publishing these indexable pages, of which there are, like I say, over 1 million of them. So what the loop looks like is basically Sneak Advisor will publish these new package pages that, including data on newly found security vulnerabilities, for example. It will publish into these indexable pages. Developers are out there just searching for packages and they see links to Advisor. So they click on some of those links, they learn about and compare the characteristics of packages they're considering using, and because of that become aware of Sneak. And viewing Advisor pages drives developers to sign up or return to Sneak. So that's another one. And of course, you've got various different kinds of viral loops in terms of word of mouth that we already talked about. Just invite loops, inviting other people in your team or other people in a consumer context, other people to collaborate with you on the things that you're interested in. Referral loops, which are typically incentivized. So you often then have some kind of incentive for both the referrer and the referee. And actually, when you're thinking about referral loops, that's often something that is, those are the typical variables that you're trying to balance in finding those, but they're incentivized. But those are all kinds of viral loops. And then ad loops as well is another one. It's a type of paid loop where you're investing capital in paid advertising and you're driving users to the product through that means.
Okay. One thing I was thinking about is that all of these growth loops, they require resources and time. So how do you balance going into quality, investing more into one, or going more broad in quantity? So how do you balance this?
Yeah, great question. So This is part of developing the growth strategy. And when you are identifying and documenting these loops, you'll typically build this kind of qualitative model, which is your understanding in plain English terms and maybe in a flow chart what these loops look like, the different steps in them, how they work together. But then you'll also have some kind of quantitative representation of them. So you'll understand the inputs to each step in each loop and the lossiness of each step in the loop. If you go through that kind of advisor loop, how many users that are searching in Google for packages actually click on those links, from the ones that visit the advisor pages, how many sign up as new users, and so on. And the same with any kind of loops, quantifying them to understand the current performance, the performance over time, and the expected performance, knowing what you know about the constraints of the loop, evaluating and estimating when some of those loops you believe will plateau and when you'll need to extend them. For example, with that advisor loop, have we saturated that loop for users of a particular package ecosystem npm? Do we need to actually extend the coverage into different package ecosystems to access a new set of the market and extend the horizon of that loop? Or is it time to think about reinvesting the resources that we're focused there into a different loop, for example? And these are not always easy decisions to make, but they are supported by the data that you build in a quantitative model. And that allows you to make just better informed decisions about where you're prioritizing. But ultimately, what you're looking for with all of this stuff is like, where are your biggest points of leverage in that overall model? Are there things that with low investment can have outsized impact on your growth?
Okay, perfect. So now I wanted to go back to something that you already alluded to, which is this transition that some companies have to go through from being sales-led to product-led, and it can be challenging. So what are some common pitfalls that you already noticed that happen that companies face, and how can they navigate these challenges?
Yeah, I think it probably varies depending on where you're starting from, whether you're PLG native or whether you're historically sales-led. I think it's more difficult if you're starting from a traditional sales-led company. I think there is a huge amount of cultural inertia that you have to overcome, moving from that buyer-centric culture to one that revolves around the user and around helping users and their teams realize value before you're trying to extract value. There's a lot of kind of pitfalls that traditionally sales-led cultures can encounter if you don't approach a product-led sales initiative in the right way. You'll see some of the symptoms of this, like salespeople reaching out to every sign up that is registered in the system. That's just characteristic of not approaching the rollout of that initiative in the right way. And the right way to do it is, in fact, to find someone within the sales team that has a highly customer value centric perspective and a mindset of experimentation. Pair them up with someone in product or growth, pair them up with someone in data and ops, and have that little tiger team work on defining a very simplistic scoring model, a simplistic playbook based on one context, one scenario, and working to iterate that to get to a point where you have something that is reproducibly successful that you can start to roll out to the broader team.
Cool. I guess a lot of times what happens is that companies start having this interest in PLG as it's becoming more and more common. Sometimes there's someone internally that's trying to push for this change from the traditional sales model.
Yeah.
But in some contexts, you don't fully get rid of this sales-led part. It depends on the context, of course, but in some cases it's trickier. But how especially for these situations when there's this sales led and it will still be the sales part, how can you layer PLG on top of it without causing friction or without hurting the sales motions? Also, like maybe how you can you measure success of this model without hurting the results of the sales processes?
Yeah, I think key is starting with that small tiger team. The worst thing you could probably do is go in and say, we're going to throw away everything that's worked for us, all the history of the company, and this is the new way we're going to do things. So starting small and proving it out and providing reproducible playbooks and frameworks that the rest of the revenue team can adopt is key. Having revenue leaders who are fully supportive of the initiative is another key ingredient. It's going to be a really tough job if you don't have a CRO or a head of sales who really believes in the value of this approach. So having those things in place is key. Of course, there's got to be the right product fundamentals, right? If you don't have a product that can effectively get users to value such to the point that they can then be stewarded through the remainder of their buyer journey through someone in the revenue team, then it's going to be incredibly tricky. There's not going to be a good time to reach out to those users if your product itself isn't providing value. But you've got to remember the optimal place for revenue teams to engage in a product-led sales process is in the things that they are great at, which is overcoming a lot of the buying friction in complex organizational dynamics. Letting the product and ensuring the product can do the heavy lifting in demonstrating user value is one thing. And self-serve monetization is great for individual or small team usage. But there's going to be a point where it becomes really difficult for a pure play self-serve motion to scale to a certain level. And that's where, for those companies that are starting from that end of the spectrum, a product-led sales approach starts to make a great deal of sense in overcoming a lot of that organizational friction and demonstrating the company level value that the product is typically just not very good at doing.
Yeah. And one of the things that we see that is critical in a PLG model is the onboarding. So are there any principles that kind of guide you in terms of designing an onboarding experiences that quickly deliver value to users in this case?
Yeah, I think that you really said the key to that question in the question itself, which is value, right? Yeah. Onboarding shouldn't be about showing the multitude of features that you have. It should be about doing the minimum that is necessary to quickly get the user to, and potentially their team, because you have to consider not just the first user on the onboarding, but in a B2B context, the nth user onboarding and how they work together, to get the user and their team to a point where they have realized some value and are starting to build habits around using the product. It's only when they get to that point that their likelihood to retain in the mid and long term and their likelihood and propensity to buy is increased. So that's the sole job of your onboarding, is to take users, new users and teams through that journey from zero to value and habit.
Okay, perfect. So now we're getting to the end, but we want to talk about the future as well, looking into the future and get your opinion. Are there any trends that you see that are going to shape the future of product in this case, and especially growth in B2B startups?
Yeah, I think we've probably touched. There's a ton of stuff that's cliched around AI that I won't kind of go into. I'm sure pretty much everyone talks about that stuff. But I think something that's been, centric to our conversation today is I think we will see a continued shift to user centricity. We'll see a continued shift to teams working closer together across different parts of the org, with users and their teams at the center of how they think about their work and about working together. More and more historically sales-led organizations that have that buyer centricity in their DNA will start to shift to have deeper empathy and deeper understanding of the importance of focusing on effectively solving user problems, because it makes overcoming the rest of that buyer journey significantly easier when doing so. So I think we'll see that. I think we'll also see a move away from polarization in go-to-market models. So we'll see a greater understanding and acknowledgement that it's not product-led growth versus sales-led growth, but how the two can work together synergistically in a hybrid model where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, where 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah, cool. That's when math doesn't math, but it's a
Exactly.
good sign.
Yeah.
Cool. And another thing, for what advice do you commonly give to growth stage startups, or what do you wish more startups and scale-ups knew about growth and product that you don't see them knowing that often?
Yeah. And it really depends on the stage of the startup, and it's hard to give universal advice. But what I will say is a lot of teams, I think, early stage startups try to chase growth too soon. They maybe see early signs of product market fit, and try to put everything into growth at that point. And the reality is they don't have product market fit. They don't have strong, flattened usage-based retention at some significantly high level. They haven't learned how to repeatedly monetize that usage. And so I think chasing growth too early is definitely something that's problematic. Certainly founders should be thinking about how they're going to grow, but not to the detriment of really establishing that strong product market fit.
Yeah, not jumping into growth before product market fit, essentially.
Yeah.
Exactly. So now we're going to go into our fun section, the sprint questions. So it's simple questions for simple answers. What is one digital product that you struggle to live without?
Obsidian.
Okay, that's a new one. Never heard that one. Okay.
Yeah, it's a digital note-taking application. Allows you to create a Zettelkasten of connected notes that helps me organize all my thoughts and my life, basically. So.
Okay, perfect. And what's the most underrated skill in product management?
Most underrated skill in product management. It's a great question. I would say possibly managing up.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know if it's the most underrated, but I definitely agree that's misunderstood and not well applied, that's for sure. So, and the last one is, if you could shadow any product manager or leader for a day, who would it be?
I'd have to say Brian Chesky, just to really get behind the scenes of all of that furore that he caused in some of his things about how product management at Airbnb is changing, and the role of product managers, and really trying to understand the pros and cons of that on the ground. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan as well. So I agree with that. So now we're going to go into our release notes. So go ahead.
All right, then let's go to the release notes. So this is what our users can take out of this conversation. And yeah, please correct me if I misunderstood anything. Essentially, PLG is about creating experience that people love using, they keep using, and they talk about. It's all about making sure that they experience value before paying. Your approach to product has always been around delighting users. And then we talked about the fact that PLG is a customerization of B2B. And yeah, exactly. So it's B2B becoming more like B2C.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, and then we also mentioned that even the most sales-led company should have some elements of PLG. In some cases, for instance, HR or finance systems, there is no option for individuals to start using different systems. You still need the sales motion there. But PLG can play an important role in retention and making sure that the experience is better than anything else. And if you don't, eventually your competitors or some new competitor will do it.
Yep.
Then over the last few years, there has been some more nuanced and scientific approach to PLG, and that comes with the maturity of the space, but the essence remains the same, particularly in monetization and its relation with product-led sales. It's probably the areas where there's been more growth or new things coming up in the last few years.
Yep.
Then we talked about the fact that it's important to understand where the company is coming from before trying to change too much, especially when you're stepping into a new organization. And to get people on board, you need to say the same thing several times in many different ways. You also need to know your context very well. This is the core first step. So we're talking about core business priorities, vision, strategy, opportunities, tech constraints, etc. And if you get this step wrong, everything else after that can fall apart. You mentioned also a bit about how to design the org and get the organization aligned in this direction. There's two dimensions to it. The macro level, which is about defining the teams and the focus of each team, in which product is relatively straightforward, but when it comes to growth, it's a bit trickier to define what will be the focus. And then on the micro level, it's about what roles you have inside each team and also who will be the exact people in each team, which again, in product, it's more or less standardized, but in growth, it can be more challenging because it involves other areas like having SEO or not, or having a marketing person, and all these things can be a bit more challenging to set. And you have to work with the things the people that you already have. Yep. And yeah, you also mentioned that an important thing you have to do as a leader also is removing barriers, setting up the processes, tooling, making sure that people have access to the relevant data and the relevant tools to do their work, and also operational support, making sure that they have this support to do their best work.
Yeah. I'll just add to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can't remember if I mentioned it at the time, but I think the co-creation of the environment is an often aspect. It shouldn't be my responsibility as a product leader just to say this is the environment, and it should be something that's collaboratively designed with other product leaders, product managers, the teams themselves within the organization, to having some investment and involvement in co-creating your environment is, I think, a big motivator for teams in terms of creating an environment that works.
To also have some ownership in the result of the org. Cool. So yeah, then we talked a lot about loop-based growth, and essentially this is about understanding how you're growing today and thinking through it. There's different types: viral, content, paid, and these things are essentially the fuel and also the constraints that you have in each loop. So you can reinvest the output of the loop into the loop itself. Eventually, the simplest loop for people to understand is the viral word of mouth loop. And essentially, to build these things, the first step is to understand them. And then the second step is think about how they relate to each other and how they can work together. That's the essence of growth, the growth strategy. And there can be some existing growth loops already that you leverage, reinforce, but you can also layer more on top of it as you start identifying more options. Yeah, then we talked about some examples just for people to have as a reference. User-generated content loop, one like Quora. Company-generated content loop like the Sneak Advisor. So programmatically generated indexable pages. Word of mouth, there's invite loops and referral loops. These last ones are typically incentivized ones. There's also ad loops, so paid loops. You need to invest capital, get return, then invest more capital. So that's the fuel analogy.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then you mentioned that for this first step, it works well to do it in a flowchart and sometimes also in just a written description of what all these loops are and how they can work with each other. But also it's important to have a quantitative evaluation of the performance and the expectation and also the constraints of each loop. For each of them, you need to understand when they will plateau and when you need to extend them to make sure that you're investing, as people say, get the biggest bang for the buck. I think that's the expression. Yep. So then about the difficulty in overcoming cultural inertia when you're coming from a sales-led traditional culture. One important advice you gave was finding someone in sales that has this customer centricity ingrained in them and create a team with them and people from product and growth to work together and to then create this evaluation model for the users that are activating and so on, but making sure that sales is also involved in this and start small, like without trying to change and break everything. Go step by step and show results with small increments. And also another aspect is having revenue or sales leaders on board with the approach. Otherwise, it can break the whole effort.
Yeah, it's dead in the water if you don't. So.
Exactly. And yeah, the way you can have it working still with sales is having product doing the heavy lifting of acquiring and getting people to start using, and then have sales for the things that they add the most value, which is typically removing the organizational friction in complex buying contexts. Product does the heavy work of the things that probably for sales would be trivial, and then they can come in and add value in that specific flow. Yeah, we also talked about onboarding, and it shouldn't be about showing your whole product and all the features that you have. So letting ego go and focus on taking them through the journey from start to value to have it as soon as possible. And in terms of the future trends, you believe there will be a continued shift towards user centricity and to different teams working together with the user in the center. So different teams in the org. And finally, we also talked about startups, and one thing you mentioned is that they shouldn't start investing in growth before product market fit. That can be a mistake.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think this was it. A lot of valuable insights.
No, a lot of content. We know that some of our listeners like to start by the end to listen to this and then go back, and they're going to be, whoa, we talked about all of this. So I think there was a lot going on. So I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation. And really, after this, Ben, I just have two more questions, which are, where should people go to learn more about you and your content? And really, what's the best way to get in touch with you? And if you want people to get in touch with you, that's also important.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm regularly on there posting and engaging with folks. So I love to have conversations about all of this stuff around product-led growth, product-led sales, product leadership, and so on. I also publish a newsletter, which is at plg.news. And I'd love to have folks check that out, see if they like it, and hopefully subscribe.
Yeah, perfect. We're going to link to all of that on the show notes, so they're going to be able to quickly find it. Okay. Once again, Ben, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks,
Perfect.
Ben. It was lovely to meet you.
Likewise.
Okay. Thank you. Bye,
Cheers.
everyone.
Take care.
And that's it. Thank you for listening to the Product Weekend podcast. If you want to check all other episodes, head on to our website or YouTube channel, and please follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future Product Weekend events and the Product Weekend podcast. Also, consider sending this episode to that friend who could really benefit from this content. I'm sure you can think of at least one. For now, this is Tojal signing off. Just one last thing. Remember, the weekend's over, but your product journey is just getting started.